The kitchen smells of dashi at 7 in the morning, and the television is already on, already too loud. The variety show hosts laughing at something that will be forgotten by noon, and your mother is standing at the gas range in her apron, the one with the small strawberries fading from too many washes, stirring something in the aluminum pot with a long wooden spoon that has been in the family longer than you have. The linoleum floor is cold through your socks. The rice cooker is sighing its completion song on the counter beside the sink. Outside the window, a bicycle bell rings twice on the narrow street, and a neighbor calls something to another neighbor. And the persimmon tree in the small garden is heavy with fruit that nobody will pick for another 2 weeks because your grandmother says they are not ready, and your grandmother is never wrong about the persimmon tree. This is Japan in the 1970s. Not the Japan of the bullet train photographs, not the Japan of the economic miracle press releases, not the Japan that the rest of the world was watching with a mixture of admiration and unease as it rebuilt itself from rubble into the second largest economy on earth with a speed that seemed to violate something, some natural law about how long recovery should take. This is the other Japan, the Japan of the kitchen, of the aluminum pot, of the dashi made from scratch every morning. Because your mother's mother made it from scratch every morning, and the idea of not doing it had never presented itself as an option. The 1970s in Japan was a decade that existed in the precise hinge between the old poverty and the new prosperity, and the food of that decade carries both within it simultaneously, the way a person carries both their childhood and their adulthood in the same body, visible in different proportions depending on the light. The supermarket had arrived, but the Shotengai, the covered shopping street with its individual fishmonger and tofu maker and pickler, was still the center of daily provisioning for most households. The instant product had arrived, but it lived alongside the slow product without displacing it. The way a new road exists alongside the path that people walked before the road came, both in use, both considered, each chosen depending on how much time you had and what the choice meant about who you were. The 25 meals that follow are not the famous meals, not the dishes that appear in English language books about Japanese cuisine, with beautiful photographs and precise measurements. They are the meals that happened at 6:30 on a Tuesday, the meals made from what the refrigerator held at the end of the week, the meals that the children of that decade remember not because they were extraordinary, but because they were constant, because they were the taste of being home. Ajun, because the specific combination of soy and mirin and the particular sweetness of the Yamaki dashi packet that your mother kept in a basket on the second shelf has never been exactly replicated by any restaurant or any recipe you have tried to follow in the decades since. The first was tamago kake gohan, and it was not a recipe, it was a position. It was the declaration, made at the breakfast table before full consciousness had been achieved, that today was a day that did not require elaboration. A raw egg cracked into a bowl of hot rice, a pour of soy sauce from the small ceramic bottle that lived permanently on the table beside the salt shaker and the toothpick holder, stirred roughly with chopsticks until the egg had coated every grain with a pale yellow film, and the steam from the rice had begun to set the outer layer of the white just slightly, just enough. It was eaten fast, standing up or slow, over the morning paper, depending on whether it was a school day or a Sunday. It tasted like the distillation of the word simple into something you could put in your mouth. In our world of plastic and speed, the morning smoothie has replaced it for many people. And the morning smoothie is a more complicated object in every measurable way and nourishing in a thinner, more anxious fashion. The second was kenchinjiru, the root vegetable soup that arrived in the autumn and stayed through winter without anyone deciding to make it or deciding to stop, because it was simply what autumn and winter soup was. Gobo, burdock root, carrot, daikon, konjac, taro, firm tofu, all of it cut into rough pieces and sautéed briefly in sesame oil in the bottom of the pot before the dashi was added. The sautéing step creating a foundation of toasted, nutty flavor that pure simmering never achieves. A step that the 1970s cook performed without thinking about why, because why had been absorbed into the muscle memory of the hand that reached for the sesame oil before reaching for anything else. The soup simmered for 40 minutes, and the house smelled of it for the rest of the day. And you came home from school into that smell, and it was not just the smell of food, but the smell of a specific safety, It's a safety with a temperature and a texture, and an exact relationship to the feeling of dropping your school bag at the entrance and not picking it up again until morning. The third was nikujaga, the potato and meat stew that everyone's mother made, and no two mothers made identically. The source of the first real argument about food that many Japanese people of that generation ever witnessed. Because the question of whether nikujaga should be made with beef or pork, with the Kansai beef that gave it a richer color or the Kanto pork that gave it a lighter, sweeter quality, was not a culinary question, but a regional identity question, a loyalty question, a question that said something about where the family came from that the family might not otherwise choose to say in polite conversation. The potatoes broke down at their edges as they cooked, releasing starch into the soy mirin broth and thickening it. The onions dissolved completely by the time the potatoes were tender, having given their sweetness to the liquid and taken on a transparency that made them almost invisible but essential, the way essential things often make themselves invisible. The meat was added late and cooked briefly because overcooked meat in nikujaga becomes stringy in a way that 1970s children negotiated around with careful chopstick work at the table, separating the good from the overcooked with the patience of people who had not yet learned that complaining about food was an option. The fourth was hiyayako, cold tofu eaten in summer without being cooked at all. The silken block removed from its water, placed on a small plate, and dressed with grated ginger, katsuobushi bonito flakes, and soy sauce. The bonito flakes trembling in the heat rising from the kitchen, even as the tofu beneath them was cold from the refrigerator. A plate of contradictions that the summer appetite found more appealing than anything requiring the stove. Because turning on the stove in August in a house without air conditioning was a decision with consequences that extended into the evening. The fifth was miso soup with namako mushrooms, the small, honey-colored, gelatinously capped mushrooms that came in tins through much of the decade before fresh ones became reliably available. Tipped into the dashi with a spoonful of red miso and nothing else, the namiko releasing their characteristic slipperiness into the broth and the broth, becoming slightly thicker and richer than plain miso soup. The texture somewhere between soup and something more substantial. This was the miso soup of Wednesday mornings, of mornings when the tofu was finished and the wakame had run out, and the namako tin was what remained in the cabinet, and it was the best of the miso soups, the one that required the least and offered the most, the one that several generations of children ate before school without noticing it, and spent the rest of their lives occasionally and inexplicably missing. The sixth was chikuwa no isobe age, the tube-shaped fish cake dipped in an ioba green batter of flour and water and dried aonori seaweed and fried in oil until the batter was crisp, and the fish cake inside was hot and giving, a thing that cost almost nothing and could be made in 10 minutes from ingredients that the 1970s pantry carried as a matter of routine. When it was a snack and a side dish, and occasionally on the days when no one had gone to the market and the refrigerator was in its end-of-week condition, a dinner component eaten with rice and pickles, and the mild, unspoken agreement between parent and child that this was enough, that enough was a value and not a compromise. The seventh was tamagoyaki, the rolled omelet made in the rectangular tamagoyaki pan that hung on the kitchen wall because there was no drawer deep enough to store it flat, cooked in 3 thin layers that were rolled over each other with a precise, unhurried motion that the children of that era watched their mothers perform with the same uncritical admiration they gave to any skill practiced so frequently it had become invisible. The tamagoyaki was sweet, always slightly sweet. The sugar and mirin dissolved into the egg before cooking, and it was put into the bento box beside the rice and the pickled plum and the piece of broiled fish and the small section of broccoli. And it was the thing the children ate first, before anything else, saving the best for the first rather than the last, which is perhaps the right order and perhaps the wrong one, and is in any case the order that the tamagoyaki always required. The eighth was tonjiru, the pork and root vegetable miso soup that was more accurately a stew that had been persuaded to call itself a soup for reasons of modesty. Because tonjiru in a 1970s household was substantial in the way that only things made from the honest combination of fat and root vegetable and fermented soybean can be substantial. The pork belly cut into rough pieces and simmered with burdock and carrot and daikon and konjac until the fat had rendered into the broth and the broth had become opaque and rich. the red miso added at the end in a quantity that was not measured but was known. The hand that held the spoon having done this enough times to need no cup or tablespoon to tell it when it was right. The ninth was the ochazuki that arrived at the end of the evening, after the dinner had been cleared and the children had been bathed and the house had settled into its nighttime configuration. When the father came home from work on the last train and was too tired for a full meal and too hungry for nothing. And the solution was always the same. Yesterday's rice from the refrigerator, a packet of ochazuki seasoning from the shelf, hot green tea poured over the top until the rice softened and floated in the pale liquid, a piece of nori torn over it, a dot of wasabi if he wanted it, eaten at the kitchen table in the quiet of the house with only the sound of the clock and the occasional passing of a late bicycle on the street outside. It was the meal of the man who had been away all day, in the economic miracle, building the thing that the history books would write about, returning to a bowl of rice and tea at midnight, and finding in it, as the people of this record have always found in the simplest bowl, something sufficient and something true. The 10th was hayashi rice, the Japanese interpretation of a European hash that had traveled so far from its origin and been so thoroughly transformed by the soy and the mirin and the Japanese conception of what a sauce should do that calling it European was like calling the persimmon tree in the garden a foreign object because its ancestors had come from China. The demi-glace style sauce was made in 1970s. Households with a roux and a tin of Heinz tomato soup and soy sauce and a careful balance of sweet and savory that the recipe on the side of the hayashi rice mix packet provided, and that most experienced cooks followed approximately rather than exactly, the approximately being where the individual flavor of each family's version lived. Poured over rice on the oval plate, the white rice and the dark sauce presenting the visual contrast that Japanese food aesthetics have always exploited. It was the Sunday lunch of the 1970s, the meal that said, "Today is not a weekday." The 11th was saba no misoni, mackerel simmered in miso and mirin and sake and ginger. The fish placed skin side up in the pan and cooked without turning so that the skin crisped slightly against the base of the pan, while the flesh above it remained moist. The sauce reducing around it to a dark, intensely flavored glaze that you spooned over the rice in the bowl and that flavored the rice all the way through in a way that made plain rice, after saba no misoni, seem like an incomplete object. Mackerel was the affordable fish, the fish the fishmonger had in abundance and sold quickly because it did not keep. And the 1970s housewife understood, as the previous generation had understood about every inexpensive and perishable ingredient, that the affordable fish handled well is not a lesser meal, but a different meal, equally precise in its requirements, equally rewarding in its execution. The 12th was the nabeyaki udon that arrived on cold evenings in the individual clay pots that the kitchen had in a stack of varying sizes. Each pot the exact width of one serving. The udon noodles and the fish cake and the single prawn and the egg and the spinach, all arranged in the pot with the visual care that Japanese cooking applies to even the most casual weeknight meal. The care that says, "I see you. I am feeding you." The act of being seen and fed is not diminished by occurring on a Tuesday. But the grandmothers knew a different secret about the 13th meal, which was kabocha no nimono, the simmered squash that appeared on the table in small lacquered dishes beside the main meal so consistently through the autumn and winter that it became, for the children of that decade, inseparable from the season itself, the way the smell of a certain thing becomes inseparable from the time in your life when you smelled it most. The squash was cut with the skin on and simmered in dashi and soy and marine until the flesh was tender and the skin had softened to match it. And it was eaten cold as often as warm because it improved as it sat, the flavors deepening and the texture becoming more dense and satisfying, and it could be made in quantity on Sunday and eaten across the week without diminishment. The last piece on Friday tasting as good as the first piece on Sunday, and in some ways better because you knew it was the last. The 14th was the chilled summer noodles of midsummer, the thin wheat noodles that had been kept in their dried, bundled form in the pantry through all the seasons and were produced in July and August with a speed and efficiency that the season demanded, boiled briefly, shocked in cold water, piled on a bamboo zaru over ice, accompanied by a small bowl of tsuyu dipping broth with grated ginger and sliced myoga, and sometimes a single shiso leaf floated on the surface. The meal required 15 minutes from start to table and was eaten in the shade of whatever shade was available. And in the cold of the noodle against the heat of the afternoon was the most precisely correct temperature relationship that the decade produced. The 15th was the gyoza that the family made together on Sunday afternoons. The father and mother and children gathered around the kitchen table with the round wrappers and the bowl of pork and cabbage and garlic and ginger filling, each person folding their own with whatever technique they had developed. The father's pleats neat and identical from some long-ago practice. The children sealed shut and blunt and slightly overfilled half circles that burst at their seams during frying and were eaten first because they were irregular, and irregulars were not for guests. The gyoza were fried in the iron pan in a circular arrangement, hot water added and the lid clamped down for the steam phase, the lid removed and the heat raised for the final crisping of the bottom. The pan inverted over a plate with a single confident motion that distributed them in a circle with their crispy sides facing up. The soy and vinegar and chili oil mixed in a small dish beside them. Eaten immediately, eaten fast. The whole family eating together in the way that making a meal together commits you to eating it together, which was perhaps the real purpose of the Sunday gyoza, not the gyoza at all, but the table. The 16th was tofu no dengaku, blocks of firm tofu threaded on flat wooden skewers and grilled over the gas flame until the surface had taken on the faint char that the miso glaze applied over it required to become fully itself, i.e., the sugars in the miso caramelizing under the heat into something that tasted simultaneously of fermentation and fire, of old and new, of the farmhouse and the apartment, because dengaku was ancient and the gas range was modern, and together they produced something that neither could produce alone. The 17th was the dish that the records of the 1970s household reveal in its function as the meal that stretched. Oyakodon, the chicken and egg rice bowl, where a small amount of chicken, less than would satisfy if eaten alone, was simmered in a sweet dashi broth with onion until barely cooked, then surrounded by beaten egg, poured in a slow circle, and given just 30 seconds more heat before being tipped over a bowl of rice, the egg still trembling at its edges. The chicken giving its flavor to the sauce, and the sauce giving its flavor to the rice, and the rice receiving everything with its usual patience. 1 chicken thigh, 2 eggs, 2 servings. The arithmetic of the oyakodon was the arithmetic of the entire decade. How to make enough from not quite enough, and make it feel like more than enough. The 18th was the cold, leftover rice transformed into chahan, the fried rice made in the iron pan with yesterday's rice, broken up with wet hands before it went into the hot oil, an egg scrambled through it, whatever the refrigerator offered, a piece of ham or the last of the chikuwa, or a handful of frozen corn or nothing but soy and green onion. The wok technique adapted to the small gas range that could not produce the high heat of a professional kitchen, but that a skilled hand could coax towards something close enough. The rice grains separating and toasting in the oil, and becoming something different from what they had been the night before, something with more texture and more character, and the particular appeal of the transformed, the thing that was one thing and became another without being wasted. The 19th was kakiage tempura, the mixed fritter of whatever thin-cut vegetables had accumulated at the bottom of the refrigerator drawer through the week, carrot and burdock and onion, and occasionally a few small shrimp if the budget extended, bound together in a loose tempura batter and dropped in careful portions into hot oil. The batter crisping around the edges while the center remained slightly soft, eaten with tentsuyu dipping broth or simply with a pour of soy over rice, the whole thing requiring 15 minutes, and producing a result that the week's accumulated vegetable remnants had not individually suggested was possible. The 20th was zoni, the New Year soup eaten on the first 3 mornings of January with a reverence that the rest of the year's eating did not quite match. The mochi rice cake softened in a clear dashi broth with mitsuba and yuzu peel and the specific ingredients that each family's regional tradition specified, and that no family in the 1970s would have considered substituting because the New Year's soup was not food exactly, it was identity. And it was the statement made to the new year about who you were and where you came from and what you intended to carry forward. The 21st was the Inari Zushi that appeared in bento boxes and at picnics and at the school sports day. The fried tofu pouches, sweetened in dashi and stuffed with seasoned rice, their surface slightly tacky from the cooking liquid. Their interior giving and warm, requiring no chopsticks and no plate, and no decision more complex than which end to bite first. They were the portable meal before the portable meal was a category, the thing that traveled without a container, that needed no refrigeration for the hours between making and eating, that children put entirely in their mouths and adults ate in two considered bites. The 22nd was the kinpira gobo that appeared in small side dishes through the week. The burdock root and carrot julienned to the width of matchsticks and sautéed in sesame oil with sugar and soy and a pinch of red pepper, then scattered with sesame seeds, eaten cold or at room temperature as a condiment, a side, a between meal thing that you picked at from the dish in the refrigerator when you were not quite hungry enough for a meal but too hungry for nothing. It improved for 3 days in the refrigerator and was gone by the fourth, and its disappearance was mourned briefly and practically replaced by the next batch, which was also ready in 15 minutes and also improved for 3 days. The 23rd was dorayaki made at home on weekend mornings. The 2 small pancakes of honey-sweetened batter sandwiching a filling of sweet red bean paste made from the azuki beans that had been soaking since Friday night. Decooked slowly on Sunday morning with sugar and a pinch of salt until they were dense and sweet and entirely themselves. The pancakes made on the griddle one by one and paired by size with the attention to symmetry that Japanese aesthetics applies even to the most domestic object, eaten at the table with green tea, the combination of the sweet bean and the slightly bitter tea being one of the most precisely calibrated flavor relationships in the entire history of the Japanese kitchen. The 24th was ochidori, the simmered chicken thighs in a dark sweet soy broth with burdock and egg. The eggs hard-boiled and then peeled and dropped into the simmering pot to absorb the color and flavor of the broth until their whites had turned the amber of old wood and their yolks had taken on a flavor that plain hard-boiled eggs do not possess. A meal that required an hour of simmering attention and that the smell of it cooking performed the work of calling the household to the table without any announcement being necessary. The 25th is the one that does not have a specific name because it was not a specific dish, but a state of being, a condition of the 1970s kitchen that produced meals without being asked to produce a particular meal. The nabeya, the pot of whatever was there, set on the gas ring at the center of the low table on cold evenings, the portable gas burner that was the great domestic technology of the decade, allowing the table itself to become the kitchen, the family to cook and eat simultaneously, the mother to sit at the table rather than at the stove, the meal to be a conversation rather than a delivery. Whatever the week had left was arranged on the plate beside the pot. The last of the tofu, a few shiitake, some napa cabbage, a piece of fish, the remaining noodles, the end of the carrot. It went into the pot in whatever order made sense and came out in whatever order was ready. The broth was whatever the pantry offered, dashi and miso, or dashi and soy and sake, or just dashi with a piece of kombu. The simplest possible backdrop for the ingredients to present themselves against. And they sat there, the family of the 1970s, around the low table with the portable gas burner and the shared pot, the television on in the corner with the volume lower than it had been at breakfast, the day outside having gone entirely dark and the persimmon tree invisible through the window but known to be there. The children doing their homework between bites with the focused inattention that children apply to both activities simultaneously. The parents talking quietly about something that was not for the children's ears and that the children heard anyway and stored away for later understanding. In our world of plastic and speed, we have replaced the shared pot with the individual screen, the shared table with the individual tray, the meal that required everyone to be present at the same fire with the convenience that requires no one to be present at all. We have gained an extraordinary amount. We have also, in that specific column of the ledger, lost something that does not appear in any economic indicator and that the generation who sat around those low tables is old enough now to name. Ought to point to its absence, the way you point to the space where a piece of furniture used to stand. The slight discoloration on the floor, the outline of a thing that was there for so long it left its shape behind. The nabeya pot, the strawberry apron, The wooden spoon that was older than you were. The rice cooker sighing its completion song on the counter beside the sink. The television already on, already too loud. And the smell of dashi at 7 in the morning, which is the smell of being somewhere that knows you are there, which is the smell that 25 meals and an entire decade were built around, and which no convenience, however genuine its convenience, has yet found a way to replicate.